Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session on mainstreaming LGBTIQ and gender equality at the United Nations. I'm Luiza Veado, and I work for the UN team at RIX International. And before we start, this session is being recorded. Only the panelists here are being recorded, so none of you who are watching us will be recorded. We also have closed captions that you can click below and add them, or we also have live interpretation right now to Spanish. So if that is your preferred language, please click below. I'm just going to say that in Spanish if people are listening to us, que tenemos interpretación en español para esa sesión y que puedes clicar al botón abajo de interpretación. And thank you so much for being here. I think I got all my housekeeping ready. So before we say anything, I just want to thank my panelists for being here. And I know all of you are here to listen to them, who have a lot more important things to say than me. But I wanted to start by saying that we wanted to have this conversation because throughout this year, we've been seeing a lot of pushback against LGBTI rights, against gender, especially in multilateral spaces, which is something that we don't like to see and is something that we would expect would not be happening. We've been seeing gains all over the world, but we've been seeing losses all over the world. And also the COVID pandemic made it even clearer that we need to work together to push things forward. But we do see a pattern and we're worried about this. And I have these amazing experts to talk about this. And I'll introduce them to make this a little bit more fun while I'm asking them questions, but also because their bios are long enough that I could have an entire session just reading their entire bios. We will have their full bios in the chat, and also if you click in their profiles below. But I'll just have a short introduction to them, and we'll start with Yulia. Yulia Ehrt is the executive director at ILGA World, and she has just assumed this new role in November 2021. Welcome, Yulia. And I wanted to start with you to tell us a little bit more on what you're seeing on anti-gender and anti-LGBTI rights discourses at the UN.
Thanks, Luiza, and thanks to Outright for the invitation. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be speaking here together with my other colleagues on this panel. And yes, I've just assumed my role, so I'm still in the phase of trying to get a foot on the ground. Nevertheless, I think I want to start my intervention on anti-gender, anti-LGBTI discourse and actors with some good news. Because as of late, as Luiza has alluded to, it's been our lives in regards to these topics has been getting a little bit more difficult. However, ILGA World, as many of you will probably know, is based in Geneva, and we are working a lot in the Geneva-based human rights mechanisms. And compared to other human rights spaces, multilateral ones, like the UN in New York, for example, Geneva has not seen as many anti-gender, anti-LGBTI, anti-rights actors as other spaces have. I mean, I think by far not as many as, for example, CSW, which is kind of the traditional battleground where progressive feminists and SRHR activists on the one hand clash with anti-rights conservative actors, and right of abortion, etc. is like the big battleground in CSW. We haven't seen that in Geneva to that extent. Yeah, unfortunately, that's where the good news ends, because because as well in Geneva, we have seen an increase. I think when I started working for ILGA, that's 3 years ago, those actors have been basically nowhere, and that has changed. So we're seeing an increased activities of anti-rights actors, but as well anti-gender and anti-trans actors, and narratives popping up everywhere in our work. And that's both in the multilateral spaces, but as well in our own movements. And before I continue, I think it's probably worthwhile spending maybe 1 or 2 minutes to walk you through what are those different actors and what are the different agendas, because I think there's very different actors which are labeled either anti-gender, anti-LGBT, anti-trans, or anti-rights. And I think there's 3 classes of those actors. One are the traditional conservatives, who are against abortion, who are against liberal and feminist values. They've been there forever, probably since women have asked for the right to vote more than 100 years ago. They've been there for all the time, basically, and they're still there. But then there's like anti-gender actors who challenge the notion, that gender even is a useful lens in the human rights landscape and in addressing social and economic inequalities. So those actors would argue we have to go back to sex-based discrimination. They've been around for a long, long time as well. And then there's the kind of the classical anti-trans actors who oppose the right of self-identification of trans persons. There's a notion that those actors are new, and I actually have said that as well. To be honest, I'm not quite sure whether they are new. They have been around for a long time too, and I've myself been, thrown out of women's spaces already 15 years ago on grounds that I was not a woman. But all three actors, have changed the way how they work, and I think that's new. So the actors have been around, all three of them, traditional conservatives, anti-gender actors, anti-trans actors have been there for a long time. But what has changed and what is new is the way how they work. Like one, there's a number of actors whose mission it actually is to portray those ideas in the first place. Two, the anti-gender and the anti-trans and anti-rights actors start to use human rights-based language in the way how they work. And I think that's new too. And then three, I've so far been speaking about civil society, but among our traditional allies, among states in particular, a couple of traditional allied actors have been taking a hit because some states have shifted their center of attention. And I think the two most prominent are probably Poland and Hungary, resulting in a strong, hit of the European Union, who has been very strong in supporting LGBTI rights, feminist rights, women's rights, and as well trans rights as of late. But since Poland and Hungary have moved more towards anti-gender narratives and then being anti-LGBT and the core of their, of the arguments and what they stand for, the European Union has had a harder time in defending those rights. So and there's more examples like that, but I think those are the two most prominent. So the bottom line is our traditional allies among the states have had a hit. And then finally, and I want to conclude my intervention on that notion. It's as well very important to note that all these actors that I've been speaking about, the traditional conservatives, the anti-gender, the anti-trans, the anti-LGBT actors, their narratives are not only about gender, LGBTI, or trans. For men, sometimes they are. Sometimes they're just, trans and LGBTI phobic. They're anti-women's rights, fine. But very often, those narratives are used as a tool to create political momentum that has nothing to do with gender or LGBTI or women's rights. It has much more to do with, kind of a neo-political project. It has to do with gaining momentum to attack the rule of law. It has to do with gaining momentum to attack democratic practice and democratic rule. It is a distraction or used as a distraction of other inequalities and social hardships, as a distraction of socio-economic imbalances. And it's, to mobilize against ideas of liberal democracy. So why is that a tool and why does it work? Because intrinsically anti-LGBTI and anti-gender narrative, they connect to very deep-rooted notions of homophobia and transphobia. And they particularly connect very well to, traditional conservative mainstream ideas. And that's why this is working so well. And I think it's important to note that, because if we continue to respond only on gender, LGBTI, and trans issues, and fail to address the neo-political agenda of those actors, we'll continue to pull out the short end of the string.
Thank you so much, Yulia. And I took a lot of notes because I think you're 100% correct. And there's a plethora of analysis on different actors that exist. And I think that we will talk a little bit about democracy and all that in this panel today. So I'm also very excited about this, and continuing a little bit on what you're saying about the actors on this anti-gender and anti-LGBTI or anti-trans movement. I want to move it to Salam, who works as a senior UN advocacy advisor at the International Planned Parenthood Federation. advocating for sexual and reproductive health and rights for all at the United Nations in New York and beyond. And hello, Salam. I'm very happy to have you here with us today. And I wanted to ask you that we're seeing a lot of anti-LGBTI discourses in the spaces that, for those of you who are not seeing me right now, we're using a lot of air quotes, which is something I hate, feminist and women spaces that are exclusionary. Can you tell us why is it important that women's rights organizations and LGBTI organizations work together in these multilateral spaces?
Thank you, Luiza, for that introduction and also for having me on this panel. First, I'll just sort of like start by introducing what kind of work we do at IPPF, especially in the UN Liaison Office, so that you are also aware where we exist and so on. IPPF is a leading advocate of sexual and reproductive health and rights, and also a global service provider. What we do in the UN is mostly following engaging policy making spaces to empower women, girls, and young people, especially the most vulnerable situations, to access life saving services and also programs. And our analysis is sort of like based on the information that we're getting from our member association, which are located in 142 countries. And we, as much as possible, try to do our advocacy in an intersectional manner. So that's sort of like, where we're seeing things, especially in the inclusion of gender and also LGBTI issues. Coming back to your question, Luiza, yeah, it is indeed true. We are seeing a lot of anti-LGBTI discourse in feminist and women's groups. And from our engagement and knowledge of some of these discussions, this discourse is mainly emanating from the concept of gender ideology, which Julia just touched upon. And this is sort of like a common framework, as you all know, that unites many anti-gender groups to fight the common enemy, again, using the air quote. Again, it's like this progressive or pluralistic threats, which is sort of like seen as different societies. And in our work in gender equality, feminist issues, and so on, we're seeing it come up in different conversations around the inclusion of comprehensive sexuality education, for instance, or the rights of LGBTIQ people, violence against women as opposed to sexual and gender-based violence, or sex workers' rights, or sexual and reproductive rights as fundamental human rights, and so on. And similarly, in other spaces as well, this ideology is sort of like used as a very powerful weapon to counteract feminist and gender studies, and also to delegitimize and hold back the advancement and recognition of LGBTIQ people. And we have seen this across the board. And already, like in this, again, I'll stop using the air quotes, but because when I'm speaking about feminist and women's group, this is not a homogeneous group. It includes different groups, but we, as in the UN, we have like certain convenings that we call as feminists. So that's sort of like what I'm referring to. And in this spaces already, there's big divisions on certain issues. And to name a few, these are like, for instance, sex workers' rights or trans women's rights, which are not really accepted by all. So there's a division among this group in two different camps. And some abolitionists, for instance, on sex workers' rights have sort of like grabbed onto this issue to further their anti-sex worker philosophy, and also to some extent expanded it to include anti-trans and also anti-non-binary people. And as Julia has mentioned, this sort of like, understanding is like, women are defined in biological sex rather than gender, and all their rights are based on their sex, while their main targets, according to our knowledge and the engagement that we have, is actually attacks on trans people, their families and communities. And again, coming back to this again, I would also like to point out, at least from our discussions and engagement in the field, there is different understanding of like what this means in its application. Some just take it as a mere language issue, like the definition of gender, which is not possible in some languages, or some terms in terms of like their applications. For instance, chest feeding instead of like breastfeeding. We don't want to change our language just to accommodate language and so on. So this is the argument that exists. And there's also, unfortunately, the divide along the global south and global north sort of like lines in terms of like where the feminist and women's rights are coming from. And in this argument, some are using it as, this rights related to gender, sexuality, and reproduction are new, foreign concepts that are being imposed by on the global South by the West. And these argue that, like women in the global South have like more important issues to worry about, such as economic development, or these kinds of rights actually contravene our cultural, religious values and so on. So there's also that argument in terms of like what we're trying to address, which is like the understanding of gender. But in both of these arguments, seems to be like a direct anti-trans exclusionary elements, such as, the arguments on using gender as opposed to sex will actually impact processes such as data collection, or going as far as women and girls haven't really achieved equality anywhere in the world. So why are we bringing in other disenfranchised groups into this category as well? So this is the things that we're seeing in our everyday advocacy as well. But we all know, like, especially as feminists and women's rights, girls' rights advocates, this is not true. And we have to come together to debunk, this discourse. For instance, as feminists or women's rights argument, we've all sort of like agreed that we can no longer accept that a woman's natural place is in the kitchen, or that a woman's primary function is reproduction. Or we're also trying to move away from this, recognizing the family as just this patriarchal unit with a heterosexual man and woman, and actually recognizing the diversity of families in all their forms. So we are moving away from that. So there is a need to come together and debunk these kinds of discourses as well. And we also have evidence in some instances, like for instance, the comprehensive sexuality education, where the arguments around allowing children to learn about gender identity and so on will harm them or will harm society. But in fact, it is actually curbing HIV rates infections, and also realizing the fulfillment of SRHR rights and so on. So we have this evidence. So our narrative has always been to debunk this kinds of discourses about which are like which are like exclusionary. So what we have to do is condemn patriarchy as a whole, especially, as feminists. What sort of like binds us together is that elements that this rights around gender, sexuality are not a threat to society. They are actually a threat to the patriarchal order and the violence and discrimination, which is very much inherent in it. And of course, along the lines of as well, none of us are free until like all of us are free. So this is sort of like the narrative that we have to build as the feminist movement. And the other thing that I would like to add is also that this is a conversation that's happening. Unfortunately, it's also being picked by the opposition. And before it sort of like, divides the feminist movement as a whole and sort of like derailed what we have worked so much for, it's better to sort of like, start this dialogue or take it like head on and have, discussions around what sort of like brings us together rather than that what divides us. So I'll just leave it at that, and happy to take on other questions as well.
Thank you so much, Salam. And I think that a lot of what you said, I'm taking notes because I just put this panel together for me to learn a lot and to get my own thoughts in my head of everything that is happening. Everyone else thinks they're here for a panel. It's just for me. I'm being very selfish. And I think that it's really important what you're saying on the importance of the language that we're using and creating within our spaces a language together, that we're not using language as the very wrongful terminology of like gender ideology, which is not a real thing, and so on. We need to move the language forward, and within women's rights spaces also, it's so important that we all use the same language and the same narrative of combating structural issues and practices. And because of that, I want to move to our next panelist, Sophie. Hello, Sophie. I know Sophie asked me not to tell everyone this, but I will tell everyone this, because Sophie's in Australia and it's really, really, really early there. And she came to talk to us in this very impressive time. So I have to give a shout out to Sophie for that. Sophie West-Browne is UN Women's first dedicated specialist on the diverse SOGIASC and LGBTIQ plus rights. And I'm so happy to have you here with us today at this very weird time, Sophie. And I wanted you to talk about the creation of your position and how this has been a great win for us in the LGBTI movement, and tell us a lot more of like the importance of including SOGIASC as a full portfolio in the UN Women.
Yep, sure. Thanks so much, Luiza. And yes, please do forgive me. It's 4 a.m. But let's see how we go. So indeed, it is a victory for our movement. And that is very much thanks to the civil society mobilizing and advocacy efforts that have taken place over many years. And perhaps what is a lesser known fact is that there also has been a lot of internal advocacy within the UN and specifically within UN Women over the years to get this established as well. So as Luiza mentioned, it is the first ever dedicated post in UN Women focusing at the global level on LGBTIQ+ rights. It was established last June in Pride Month. And yeah, so it is one of few such posts to exist in the UN, and it is a historic step forward for UN Women as well as the system in general, I would say. It's also an indication that UN Women really aims to be a global leader in moving from rhetorical attention to concrete action in this area, which has been waning in the UN and which I'll talk about a bit more later. It also indicates a progress in UN Women's strategic and conceptual thinking around its gender equality mandate and the way it conceptualizes human rights discourses and operationalizes those. So the post itself, just very quickly to explain, it's strategically situated to work across our humanitarian, human rights and development streams. And so because of that, it sort of straddles our different areas of work in the organization. So I work across policy, programming and intergovernmental work. And within that, I work across all our different thematic areas to try and integrate and bring LGBTIQ+ rights perspectives. So yes, it is very important that we have this at UN Women. And just to elaborate on a little bit about why. So it's evident, we've already heard it from our two amazing speakers so far, that much more can and should be done at the international and national levels to protect and promote these rights. And UN Women, I think, is trying to take a lead on adopting an intersectional feminist approach in the UN to achieving gender equality. Also, I think UN Women very much has a responsibility to address the question of how we understand gender-based discrimination and gender-based violence, and really push an understanding that it impacts all people, and get outside of this sort of sometimes what has been a traditional sort of understanding that it's just focused on cisgendered women and girls. So of course, this is happening, as we all know, against a backdrop of anti-gender narratives, but we really see that as an impetus to push harder and stand our ground in this area. I can talk a little bit more about that later as well. And we really also want to be a unifying force for different gender activists working across related movements. And on that last point, I do just want to zero in for a moment on those distinct intersections across women's rights, sorry for the quotes as well, and broader gender movements. And to sort of say that I think UN Women has an important role in promoting the importance of this symbiotic relationship and helping overcome these tensions. As we all know, there has been some women's rights activists, quote unquote, who have resisted bringing attention to trans and gender diverse people in the interest of protecting gains for and maintaining attention on cisgender women. And we've, UN Women has knows that history intimately well. So I think we're really trying to navigate those fault lines within our own movements to ensure that alliances are more effective. And we have a role in retaining the focus of feminism on it being a project of transforming gender relations more broadly, a responsibility specifically for the framing of gender equality, and ensuring that we move beyond the binary that certainly UN Women has been guilty of keeping us stuck in, I would say. So we need to move beyond that conceptually, as well as in international human rights law, and in terms of also how we operationalize that on the ground. And we also have a role in responding specifically to the proliferation of anti-gender and anti-rights narratives and movements that I can talk more about later, but I think we'll all be talking about that. I think we can also provide a key entry point for civil society advocacy in UN spaces. And we need to keep ensuring that we're protecting those spaces, which we all know are shrinking. And sort of acting also more broadly as a conduit and a leverage, collaborating with civil society, but also with supportive, progressive governments and with other UN agencies. So I'll leave it there for now and talk more a bit later. Thank you, Luiza.
No, thank you so much, Sophie. And for me, it is very exciting to hear about this post and everything that UN Women is doing. And as Yulia started with a positive note, I think that we have to always go with the positive notes to lift our spirits up, because otherwise we wouldn't be doing the work that we do. And on that note, I'd like to move to Sophia Korak, who is a senior human rights and health advisor at the United Nations mission to the UN, covering a range of issues, including human rights and LGBTIQ plus issues. And I'm really happy to have Sophia here with us, because this year, the US has led a lot of LGBTI and gender inclusion work in multilateral spaces, including this year, United Nations General Assembly. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Sophia?
Sure. Thanks so much, Luiza. And I wanted to really express my excitement at being here today. I have attended the summit for many years in the past, and so it's such an honor and a privilege to be here also with really amazing panelists. And I've also been taking notes and look forward to reacting to some of the comments that were made in our next segment. Maybe just to start off, as many of you know, the Biden-Harris administration is committed to advancing gender equality and promoting and protecting the human rights of all persons, including LGBTQ plus persons. And we've done that in a variety of ways this year. And I'll save the best for last, but just to give a little bit of an overview and to say in my position, I feel very fortunate, not only leading on LGBTQI plus rights, but also being our lead on gender, as well as persons with disabilities, also health. And so I've really seen both the positive and the negative, and how it all comes together, not only in the human rights space, but the health space. And happy to talk about that in our next segment. So we've been really pleased to be at the forefront of many initiatives, including also having our highest level of representation at the Commission on the Status of Women earlier this year, with Vice President Harris delivering our statement. She also was our head of delegation at the Generation Equality Forum. We are now proud to be back on the Human Rights Council, but even before that, we led a side event during the June session on transgender rights, which was a really great way to kick off. And of course, I'm forever apologizing to Outright for this, but we are also pleased to have had President Biden appoint the position of the Special Envoy for LGBTQI plus rights, who is a well-known quantity for all of you, Jessica Stern. So she's already hit the ground running. And so while I work on our work and engagement with the UN, working closely with her team, and many more efforts to come there. So I would say in terms of our strategy, a lot of the panelists before me have talked about, seeking language that is both, I would say, a direct win and an indirect win, both on the gender front and LGBTQI plus. So, we have longstanding agreed language on advancing gender equality, some of which has been challenged. We do have only one resolution. Well, we had only one resolution with an explicit reference to sexual orientation and gender identity until this fall. We also, seek to ensure the inclusion of all persons, and including also women and girls in a non-binary way. So we have language we've been pushing. I think a few have mentioned it, such as, various forms of the family existing, women and girls and all their diversity. So the US has been at the forefront of pushing for this language, also through the UN LGBTI core group, which Outright is a key player of, and also with great leadership from our colleagues from Argentina and Netherlands. So saving the best for last, I would say that the the US runs very few resolutions in the UN generally, and we do that strategically because we prioritize really a couple of issues that we want to be at the forefront of. And so we run a biannual resolution on elections that we've been running since the 1990s. This is, I think many of you may be aware, it was the resolution that set up the UN's Electoral Assistance Fund more than 20 years ago. And so the resolution renews it every 2 years. And because of that, we try not to make usually any big splashy changes. We focus on a particular topic, but this year, given the administration's priorities, we wanted to focus on gender and political participation and also inclusion. We have seen both during the COVID-19 pandemic, but generally, unfortunately, negative shift globally at more restrictive laws and policies and legislation prohibiting persons belonging to marginalized populations from either having the right to vote or run for office. And so we have a really strong paragraph in addition to really good language on gender and political participation, calling for states to eliminate such laws, policies, and practices, including on the basis of, and we have a listing, which includes sexual orientation and gender identity. And we're pleased to say that it's been adopted by consensus in the third committee. The work is not done. We were also have one more vote next week in the General Assembly plenary, but while a number of delegations, kind of the usual suspects as Yulia and Salam and others have indicated, did disassociate from the language, nobody called a vote on the text. And so we now have two texts that run conveniently every other year that have an explicit reference to sexual orientation and gender identity. The other one is on extrajudicial and summary killings, which is voted, but in both texts, I should say as well, had amendments put forward attempting to strip the language, and they failed. In our text, it was not only on SOGI, but in all their diversity, and both were voted down this year, and then the text was adopted by consensus. And I'll just end by saying this is a big step, not only in now having a text every year with the language, but also the fact that, you know, I think for many of the delegations that we call kind of the fence sitters who it was difficult to argue, even if they don't, you know, they're not comfortable with SOGI and or have, you know, not great legislation when it comes to the basis of killing anybody on the basis of their identity. It was difficult for them to argue. Our text talks about discrimination. And so I think it's a huge milestone to also have had a text that talks about discrimination adopted by consensus. And I should add, we only lost about 20 co-sponsors. We ended up with 89 versus 104, and many delegations that don't share our views on the issue of SOGI still ended up co-sponsoring and voting in favor of the amendment. So I think for all these reasons, it's a huge win. And also there's just really great language to the other panelists' points on gender equality as well, that is consensual, that we can use in the future, and looking ahead to CSW in just a couple of months, but also third committee and the Human Rights Council as well. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Sophia. And I think that everything that you said also brings me back to think that the opposition also understands that language is important. And so it's important that for all of us to be having this conversation. And before I ask our next question, I obviously forgot something on housekeeping, as I always do. If you want to ask questions to our wonderful panelists, you can use the Q&A box below. And I forgot to tell people that, so please use it. And I want to move forward to ask the question that I want to know the most and ask all of you about this, which is, can you share with us what's been the biggest advances and the biggest challenges that you've seen in LGBTI and gender inclusion in the multilateral spaces, and specifically at the UN? I'll let that open, whoever wants to start. If not, I will volunteer you, so please.
Luiza, I'm happy to go.
Please, Sophia.
Sure, and maybe I'll weave in some of my reactions to what other panelists have said as well. I mentioned, maybe I'll start from the point I made just a few minutes ago on looking at language, you know, what we call direct and indirect references, both to SOGI, but also looking at including, so I mentioned, you know, we have formulations that we've been using, such as, you know, women and girls and all their diversity, or all women and girls, We are seeing a challenge to longstanding agreed language as well, which is alarming. I had in my prior role also followed the Human Rights Council, and I found what Yulia said interesting on not having the same feeling in Geneva on kind of the attack on gender and marginalized populations. I would say in the health space, we have seen kind of the two worlds, merge in a non-great way. We just had the high-level declaration on HIV/AIDS that many of us negotiated for much of the spring, and again, that's that should be a no-brainer. Discussion around, ensuring that all, including those most impacted and identified by UNAIDS as key populations, including, men who have sex with men, for example, that should be a given. It's factually accurate. We have longstanding agreed language, but some delegations, unfortunately, not only challenged this process, but also the UNAIDS strategic plan, which, had never been challenged in such a way before as well. Conversely, and I'll let my colleague from UN Women talk about that, but I would say we were more successful in the executive boards in that regard too. But I think the delegations are paying attention and are working together, across. I think we are as well. And so it's benefiting us in terms of pushing for the language. I'm working with my colleagues in Geneva that cover the health spaces to ensure that we're pushing for strong language on advancing gender equality, using some of the formulations I mentioned, pushing for SOGI as long as we can, before, and being strategic with like-mindeds as well. But so is the opposition on these issues. And so I think, being 2 steps ahead is very beneficial, including, greater coordination between New York and Geneva, which I'm urging, my own colleagues to do, but I think others are as well. I think, I mentioned the UN LGBTI core group. I think that's been a great avenue for us to coordinate on language over the last few years. And the third committee, I mentioned, there's been terms that have been challenged, multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, which is longstanding agreed language, not only in the GA, but also in the Human Rights Council, and actually in many of the health related documents as well, has been challenged, including by some, coordinated kind of statements this year. And so I think using the groups that we do have, particularly the groups of friends or core groups, it has been a way where we've been able to push back on some of the negative trends as well. I think cross-regional support, I mentioned our elections text said 89 co-sponsors. We were, in the halfway point at about 50, and they were truly from all regions. And I think that was really what got us to the success we had. And I think that's where we are. I mentioned the HIV/AIDS process being challenging, but we ended up with, I don't have the stats in front of me, several, I think 3 or 4 references to multiple intersecting forms of discrimination and all women and girls and all their diversity, a couple of other formulations of in all their diversity that are, not as ideal, but still achieve the same goal. And so in spite of all the challenges and unprecedented challenges, we are, making some small, some bigger wins. And I think that's the key. I think cross-regional cooperation, cross-body, cross-city, Geneva, New York, cooperation as well. I would also, on the government member state side, trying to follow what's happening in the regional bodies as well, like the OAS or the OSCE, because I think, again, both on our side, but also on those that don't share our views, the organization has been increasing. So I would say that that's our best tool right now to continue, pushing back on the greater organization on the other end too. And I think also, making really clear cohesive arguments, both on our side and pushing the other side. I've been in so many negotiations where delegations just want to delete something without explanation. And myself and other colleagues, say, okay, but you need to give us a rationale, especially if you're calling to delete longstanding agreed language. So I think just to name a few, not getting too in the UN weeds, but I think these are our best tools that we have in order to keep getting the small wins and also just finally identifying where we push for the direct SOGI language, the way that we did in our elections text, and where some of these indirect wins, which are still wins, will take us a longer way. And also incremental wins, I think, are something we tend to get excited and forget about. But looking at 2 years, 3 years out, and coming back to a text with getting more in next time around, I think is important. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Salam, I see that you want
Yes.
to add that. Yes.
Let me go next, because most of my answers are actually aligned with Sophia's intervention as well. And I think Sophia has covered it all. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the intergovernmental spaces. There's like a relentless effort to, we can lower down international standards that have been agreed 25, 30 years ago. Again, just to sort of at least from our side, in the inclusion of gender and also LGBTI language, there is sort of the continuous pushback again by certain member states to not include, and in most cases like this in the negotiations, they really want to sort of pressure, for instance, human rights mechanisms to narrow their focus, or if there's any progressive language to lower that down or ask for its deletion and so on. And most of it has been covered by Sophia. But there are also, what I wanted to add was there are also certain aspects that they want to be included as well, so that it should be in reference to culture, religion, or national sovereignty and so on. So the caveats that are always added also aims to weaken the languages as well. And there's always that argument on sexual and gender-based violence that we continue to see time and time again, to sort of again limit the focus and just include violence against women and girls as well in terms of the language discussions. My second point has also been addressed by Sophia, which is again blocking progressive outcomes or progressive language. And we've seen this again in the HIV/AIDS political declaration, but also in the CSW, where there are a few, again, a handful number of countries are sort of trying to delay the process. And again, this is a tactic that is continuously being used by certain member states to end up with either a non-consensual or a very watered down text at the end of the day. So this is something that we're also seeing. And lastly, we're also facing some discussions or discourse towards building a counter human rights framework, rather than the ones we have already under the United Nations. And this, one of the examples is the Geneva Consensus Declaration, for instance, that we've seen in our field, undermining some of the language that has already been agreed in SRHR. So this kind of move is also being, heavily utilized by the opposition, some member states and so on, to, weaken the existing language that we're seeing. So these are the main challenges that we're seeing in our field. But again, in terms of advances, maybe, and also just to end in a positive note, we are seeing quite advances, although they're very incremental, but we are seeing good advances in this inclusion narrative. The independent experts on SOGI, the report especially on gender, have shed a lot of light in terms of understanding what that is. And since it's coming from a UN mechanism, we can also use that in our arguments and also in our advocacy in this regard, within civil society, within feminist groups, and also beyond that as well, in terms of getting cross-regional momentum and cross-regional support as well. There's also the special rapporteur's report on health that has this inclusive narratives and inclusive language as well, that is very much useful for our advocacy efforts. And of course, again, congratulating Sophia and also the US in the new adopted resolution. That's also a huge achievement in the third committee. And not only the fact that it was co-sponsored, but also the fact that the hostile amendments that were presented at the end was actually voted against by 90 member states. It's also a huge win for us. So I'll just stop there. And of course, it's sort of repeating what Sophia has said, but I just wanted to add that as well.
Thank you, Salam. Yes. I love ending on a happy note every intervention, because that just makes me happy. Sophie or Yulia, would you like to add something? Sophie, please jump in.
Yeah, I'm happy to add. So yeah, I think both of the previous speakers have also sort of highlighted a lot of what I had wanted to. So I don't want to repeat that, but I can, you know, but it should be emphasized, particularly, I think, the IE Soggy's work, which has been particularly useful for us, and the recent reports on gender in particular, as well as collaborations across other across other mandate holders and treaty bodies. And there's some interesting work going on in the background around what more we can do with CEDAW, for example. But I don't think I've got time to get in that into that now. But as Sophia also mentioned, there are the threats to long-standing language that we very much see. And then, yeah, in terms of, I wanted to sort of think about advances in terms of the internal context for us in the UN, and then the sort of external context, so to speak. So I think there's been a big groundswell in the UN system, and a real sort of ever-increasing demand and interest in this work being done more systematically by UN agencies. And that's reflected in greater programmatic and policy capacity and more assured leadership. But I want to come back to the leadership point in a moment, because it's not all good. But just next, I just wanted to highlight our strategic plan, because it was brought up by the previous two speakers. Yes, that definitely is an advance. Just a couple of months ago, UN Women had its new strategic plan adopted, for those who don't know, and for the first time in our history, it includes an explicit reference to sexual orientation and gender identity. But of course, that did not come without considerable tensions and debates within our executive board of that's compiled of member states, which all the more shows how much of an important win it was, because it wasn't easy. I also wanted to highlight, in terms of the internal context, the fact that there is a new UN system-wide LGBTIQ plus strategy under development. It's far from being public, but I was given the okay to mention it today. And it comes from a high-level directive in the UN that the whole system needs to be doing more. And the hope with it is that it helps bring that more concerted high-level response that's more coordinated across agencies, and brings, you know, a more practical way forward, and more accountability on us to be doing more and saying more. Then there are advances in the external context, alongside all the challenges of the, you know, the shrinking space and all of that I won't get into now, because I'm sure it's been covered in many other sessions. The challenges are many. I'm sure we all agree. They're political, they're cultural, they're bureaucratic for us, and for some other actors, and they're economic, of course. I think it's important to understand that they're, from where I sit, I see that these challenges are both happening sort of to us, but they're also caused by us. And I speak for where I sit in this whole sort of field. I won't get into the backlash. It's been mentioned already that it has a long history, but it also has new faces and new approaches and greater funding and coordination than sometimes pro-gender actors do. I think it's important to mention, in light of what we've just been discussing in the past sort of 5-10 minutes, that where anti-gender movements have acted through delegations to seed divisions in intergovernmental spaces, that can be hard to undo. Even when administrations change for the better, we still have to sort of be cognizant of where those divisions have already been sowed across delegations, and keep working in relation to that. Which brings me to my next point just quickly, you know, in regards to the anti-gender movements. I think from where I sit, we haven't, as a UN system, taken it seriously enough, responded adequately. We haven't understood the complex dynamics, which were mentioned in the first round of presentations. And UN Women itself has been very much caught on the receiving end of that hostility and caught in the middle of the debates often. And there's a real need for us to sort of figure out how to create dialogue in this kind of polarized world. People have already talked about the intergovernmental political spaces, the challenges there, the way that our rights are used as bargaining chips, the way that text is watered down, these lowest common denominator approaches that we see. You know, there's a lot to say about national political spaces and the challenges that we see there as well, and the huge variation in how international commitments are actually reflected in law and policy. And then further, what things look like at the community level in terms of social norms and attitudes, and whether they reflect the advances at national, let alone international levels. But I'm sort of skimming over things a bit. But I wanted to return to the question of leadership and political will in the UN, because I think that that's still, you know, we need to advocate a lot more for that to continue to strengthen, so that our rights can be promoted, and so that the UN speaks out more consistently on violations and abuses. Certainly, I think, as other speakers have alluded to, there's political and bureaucratic barriers in that sense. But from what I see in my role, there's a lot of tensions at country level where our operations, there's the threats posed on our operations in terms of personal safety and security risks for our staff and officers if the UN is seen to be speaking out against the actions of particular host governments. So I think there's kind of a sinister irony there where the UN is reluctant to actually speak out against human rights at the country level sometimes. And yeah, I mean, we all suffer from the obvious things that I'm sure will come up a lot over the course of your conference around limited funding and the need for more coordinated capacity, deprioritization by donors, especially since COVID. I see discriminatory attitudes and lack of knowledge awareness within the UN amongst staff, which holds us back. And I also think, you know, it's worth reflecting more broadly on the need to sort of scrutinize power imbalances within our own organizations and across our own movements, both in terms of the UN, but also civil society organizations, as well as obviously our government partners. And sort of find ways to overcome some of those power imbalances amongst us as well. But I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sophie. Yulia, I saw that you unmuted yourself.
Yes, and I'll be quick. I'll finish on a positive note, but before I do that, let me say two things. One, I think we had a lot of gains, which we all heard and all said, but I do think that multilateral space as such needs to be defended, because multilateral space as such is under attack. And I mean, if we don't defend multilateral space, all these gains that my colleagues and me have alluded to are going to evaporate. So that's one. The other one that I wanted to say, thanks, Sophia, for bringing up the HIV resolution, because that was actually bad, to be quite blunt. And there we as well saw a pattern, I think, which we have been seeing in the Human Rights Council a couple of times this year. And it's a pattern that states water down resolution with an argument of, in order to, to consent to language, the language has to be turned down, but then they still call for a vote. So which means we end up with a watered down resolution that is not agreed language anymore. And that's been a pattern that we've been seeing a couple of times this year, which we haven't seen before to that extent in that way. And I wanted to, just mention that here and now. Of course, the resolution that includes agreed language on SOGI in the third committee, I mean, that's insane and amazing, I think, and is encouraging as well for the renewal of the independent experts mandate on SOGI, which people have been speaking about, which is coming up next year in the Human Rights Council. And I have to say that the composition of the Human Rights Council is a little bit more challenging than in previous years when it comes to the renewal of that mandate. So we'll need a lot of support from both civil society and states in order to pull that off. Because speaking about the positive developments, I think the mandate as such of the independent expert on SOGI is like a huge success. And the other thing that I think is a huge success, and my colleague has been speaking to that, is, again, the impersonation of that success is Sophie here today. And I think anything that Sophie has said today in this meeting would have sounded like, as a representative of UN Women, would have sounded like science fiction 10 years ago. And I think it's as well important to acknowledge that. And like 10 years ago, no one from, well, maybe not no one, but UN Women would just have not said the stuff that you've been saying today. And that's huge. And as well, on the fault lines, both in the LGBTI movement and the feminist movement, and I want to end on that, I think the big success of us still being here and of being able to convene, both LGBTI, trans, as well as feminist movements around the issue of gender backlash is a huge success in itself. And I think it comes from an approach over the last decades in the feminist and the LGBT movements that has been making an attempt in cultivating both an intersectional approach and in cultivating an approach that focuses on what unites us versus what separates us. And while the voices that try to separate us are often very loud, I think the bulk of our movements have been coming together and have cultivated an understanding that united we stand much stronger than separated. And I think that's actually, the basis of many of the successes that Sophie, Sophia, and Salama has been talking about earlier today. And I think it's, again, important to give a shout out to that and to continue cultivating that. Because we're not, of course, there's still misogyny and racism in all our movements. So we're not at the end, clearly not at the end of cultivating intersectional approaches. But I do think we've come a certain way over the last 2 decades.
Thank you so much. And I know this panel itself could have been the entire Out Summit because we have so many different topics on democracy, on protecting multilateral spaces, on talking about our movements, and so many other topics that are part of LGBTI issues. And we sometimes forget when we're defending other things. But I want to take my moderator privilege and give everyone 1 minute, because otherwise they're going to be really mad at me for running out of time, to final remarks, but also to address this one question that came, which is, we seen a lot of the times there's this discourse that anti-gender movement is really big and it's bigger than our own movements, which I personally think is a lie and it's just a discourse, but I would like you to address that and give us our final remarks. So everyone, Yulia, why don't we start with you? And then we'll go the other way around.
Well, thanks for putting me on the spot. But I don't think either that the anti-gender movement is bigger than us. They're just more loud, and some of the narratives connect to kind of a conservative mainstream, not a mainstream, but a conservative mainstream. And that's why those voices are heard very loud. And because there's a tradition, like a century-long tradition actually, that speaks to those kind of narratives. But I do believe if we look at the progress that we've been able to achieve both in the LGBT and in the feminist movement over the last 4 decades, I think the wins are on our side, clearly.
Thank you. Salam?
Thank you, Luiza. Yeah, I also agree. Like, they are not more, bigger than us. They might be well funded though, but they are not really that much bigger than us. And I would sort of like reiterate my last points as well on this issue, especially coming from the feminist movement. None of us are free until everyone is free. So what sort of like, unites us is, we're trying to, smash the patriarchy. So we should be focusing on that, because all of our problems, discrimination, violence, are inherent in patriarchy. And that's sort of like, our common enemy, even though different kinds of arguments are, especially within this gender ideology, sort of like arguments, a lot of sort of like the anti-rights agenda seems to be united, but we are much stronger and we can be able to support that as long as we are coming together. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Salam. Sophie?
Yep, hi. Okay. I'll first just make one comment and sort of following up on a little bit what Yulia was saying, and then sort of respond to the question very, very quickly. The point about, I want to make a point about trust of the UN. in general, because I recognize from having worked in different spaces and being part of LGBTIQ plus communities myself, that there hasn't always been a lot of trust of the UN and faith in it on the part of our communities, for good reason, very often. And but all I can do is speak for myself when I say that I would want everyone here to know that, at least in my role, I see it as being existing to be of service to our communities. And that's why it exists, and that's why UN jobs should exist always. So I always intend to try and sort of keep my feet on the ground in that regard. And then I would sort of say more broadly that, you know, just appeal to all gender actors to work together, sort of as a way of responding to that question. I think that we are bigger and stronger. We just haven't had the funding and the coordination. I mean, there's all sorts of ways you can analyze it, but not right now. So we just need to keep finding common bonds and strengthening these alliances. And also, I would really encourage activists working in these spaces to stand firm and not allow their interests and rights to be watered down in UN spaces. And in that sense, please work with me and let's work together, and it'll all continue to slowly pay off. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. And last but not least, Sophia.
Thanks so much, Luiza. I'll be brief too. I fully agree with everything everyone said. I did want to just quickly respond to the great point Yulia made, which is, you know, we've talked about successes and it's great to end on a positive note, but we don't want to rest too easy because the work is still there before us. As I mentioned, you know, even on our text, you know, there were quite a few, there were some delegations that spoke out, you know, on the SOGI issue and also on some of the other terms. And so we want to ensure that this great cross-regional coordination is continuing. I think to answer the question, I fully agree with you and everybody else that the other side voices are not, that movement is not bigger, they might be louder, but I also think that we're becoming louder, and we're becoming louder in a more cross-regional way, including also, you know, dispelling the narrative that sometimes comes about that this is a, you know, a Western states, you know, ideology, et cetera. And so we're really showing that this is an issue that is critical for countries around the world, and bringing everybody together. And so I think just continuing to build on that good cooperation. And, you know, I always tell colleagues, just show up to the room, even if you have a busy schedule, just come in for the critical 2 or 3 or 5 paragraphs and make sure that your delegation's voice is heard, to show that we are indeed actually the louder voices. So, and thank you again to you and Outright for having us today.
No, thank you all. And I hope everyone who's listening to us is as revigorated and with so many ideas as I had, and also to continue working together with this amazing group of panelists who are doing a lot of amazing work that gets me really excited. And this is our last session of the day of our Art Summit. We will have more sessions tomorrow at 10 a.m. and also on Friday. We're so happy to have you here, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And one of my amazing tech people will have a survey put on the chat that if you have time to respond, please do. And to my panelists, I cannot thank you enough. This is, you know, a star panel. I couldn't have wished for a better one. I got, you know, the most brilliant people to talk to me today. So thank you so much.
Thank you.